Welcome to Soundscape Books. You're listening to an exclusive audiobook recording of Ash and Iron, a tale of metal magic, rebellion, and the price of freedom in a world shrouded in volcanic darkness. Written by Darian Cross. Like and subscribe for more content. Enjoy.
Chapter 1: Ashes and Echoes. The air itself pressed down, a thick, acrid haze of industrial smoke and coal grime that burned the back of Marcus Ash's throat as he emerged from the shadowed moor of the old smuggler's tunnel. Above, the eternal dusk of Tehran, the capital, hung like an oppressive canopy. 2 centuries of the Steel Emperor's reign had woven this sunless pall, fed by the ceaseless industry that churned below. The city suffocated him. Each inhale tasted of ash, a familiar tang that stirred old scars. A heavy ache of grief for the family torn from him settled deep in his chest. 5 years in the quarries had etched new lines onto his face, but the old ones, carved by fire and loss, ran deeper still. His gaunt features were hardened, his eyes shadowed but sharp, reflecting a grim determination. He moved with a quiet, practiced ease, his gaze sweeping the skeletal scaffolding of industrial behemoths and the cramped, leaning hovels below. The city's immense weight, both physical and unseen, settled on his shoulders. He'd carried it before, but this time he wouldn't break. This time he would fight back. His journey from the quarry camps had been a silent, brutal crawl through forgotten passages and the fringes of the Empire's surveillance. Now, at the edge of the capital's sprawl, the sheer scale of the imperial machine was undeniable. Its metallic hum was a constant, oppressive thrum beneath the soles of his worn boots. The very atmosphere vibrated with the unseen gears of control, a low, relentless drone. He watched the enslaved populace, their faces etched with the same weary resignation he knew so well, shuffling through the grime-slicked streets. Their movements were stiff, joyless. Their eyes, hollow and defeated, carried the city's vacant dread. Imperial Guard patrols, their armor gleaming dully in the perpetual haze, moved with an unassailable authority. Their measured steps echoed, a constant, chilling reminder. A child, no older than his own daughter would have been, stumbled, dropping a meager bundle of scrap metal. An imperial overseer barked, the sound cracking like a whip. The sharp, cruel command sliced through the din. Marcus's jaw tightened. A bitter heat of old rage coiled in his gut. The memory of his own helplessness, his own loss, flared. The metallic tang of the air sharpened, pulling him back. Not to the present, but to the memory of Black Mountain. The smell of burning wood, the acrid scent of scorched earth, the coppery tang of blood, it all rushed back. The stench of destruction, the taste of iron, threatened to overwhelm him. He remembered the roar of the fire, consuming everything, the screams swallowed by the inferno. The searing heat, the chaos, the sickening panic. His hands, then younger, less scarred, had tried to hold back the devastation, to shape the collapsing metal defenses, but it had been too much. The steel had buckled, the fortifications crumbled, his efforts futile. He'd seen the Emperor's personal guard, a terrifying blur of dark steel, cutting through his fellow full smiths, his family. Their blades flashed, merciless and swift, leaving a trail of death. His wife's face, etched with defiance and fear as she pushed their son into his arms, telling him to run. Her eyes, wide and desperate, were the last thing he saw. Then, the crushing blow, the darkness, and the waking nightmare of the quarries. The world had dissolved into pain and captivity. The embers of that past defeat still smoldered, hot and painful, within his chest. They fueled a cold, hard resolve that 5 years of forced labor could not extinguish. It was a fire of vengeance, a promise whispered to the dead. He shook his head, pushing the specters back, though they never truly left. The fraying edges of memory receded, but the scars remained. His focus returned to the present, to the oppressive reality of the capital. This city, built on their shattered lives, was where a new beginning would take root. It was here that the emperor's reign would begin to unravel. He needed a place, a shadow to call his own before he could truly begin. A sanctuary, however temporary, was essential. He moved deeper into the industrial district, the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam a constant, mechanical drone. The air grew thick with the smell of hot metal and oil. Every alley offered a fleeting glimpse into the hard lives of the working class, their meager existence defined by the empire's relentless demands. Their faces were grim, their movements mechanical, slaves to the ceaseless pace. He observed the subtle ways the imperial presence manifested. The patrols, yes, but also the small, almost invisible surveillance devices, metallic eyes that watched from the grimy brickwork. They were everywhere, tiny, unblinking. One such device, a polished brass sphere barely larger than his thumb, pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible light from a niche above a darkened doorway. It was positioned to monitor a narrow alley, a common thoroughfare for the city's forgotten. Marcus paused, feigning interest in a discarded cogwheel, his senses extending, a subtle reach of awareness. The cogwheel itself was bent, useless, but the way the light caught the rust, he noted it. He waited for the alley to clear, the clatter of a passing cart providing a momentary distraction. His hand remained still, but beneath the rough fabric of his glove, his fingers twitched with an almost imperceptible motion. A whisper, a silent command, flowed from his mind, not to the air, but to the metal itself. The brass sphere gave a tiny, almost inaudible click. The faint light that had pulsed within it flickered, then died, leaving the alley in a deeper, more complete darkness. No spark, no smoke, no outward sign of tampering, just silence, a ghost in the machine. A subtle victory, one that would, he hoped, send a tremor through the Empire's meticulously maintained order. He continued on, his stride purposeful now, a quiet satisfaction settling in his gut. The act was small, insignificant in the grand scheme, yet it was a beginning. A quiet declaration to the Empire that he was back. A shadow returned from the ashes, and their complacent grip was about to be tested. He navigated through a maze of back alleys and crumbling tenement buildings, the air growing colder, thick with the metallic tang of distant forges, the silence deeper, punctuated only by the scuttling of unseen things. He found a forgotten alcove beneath the rusted framework of an abandoned factory. It was damp and smelled of decay, but it was hidden, shielded by layers of discarded scrap and the sheer indifference of the city. This would do for now. He settled into the deepest shadow, his gaze drawn inevitably towards the distant, towering spires of the imperial palace, piercing the darkened sky like hungry blades. Their cold light seemed to mock the perpetual twilight that clung to the capital, pressing down on every hovel, every desperate whisper, and every soul trapped beneath its industrial haze. Vengeance would find its way, and a new path would break the chains that bound this world. The search for the full Smith began. Chapter 2: The Whispering Alley. The world outside their hovel was a perpetual twilight, a landscape of rust and gloom under the industrial haze that clung to the capital like a shroud. The air, thick with the metallic tang of the forges, pressed down on everything. Below, the narrow alleyways were choked with refuse and the desperate whispers of the city's forgotten, a chill that seeped even into their meager dwelling. Elarra, crouched low beside a stack of scavenged crates, traced the grimy outline of an imperial supply box with a practiced eye. Her focus was absolute, an unyielding concentration born of desperation. Every rivet and seam of the reinforced metal was etched into her memory, each curve a guide to the treasures within. "That's it, Lyra," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant clanging from the imperial forges. "The one with the double lock. They think it's secure, but they always get sloppy with the third shift." Lyra peered through a crack in the wall, her quick fingers already testing the tension in a loose brick. Her brow was furrowed, a faint line of worry etched between her dark eyebrows. "Sloppy or not, the patrols are tighter than usual tonight," she murmured, her voice tight with apprehension. "Heard a whisper about a missing shipment down by the docks. They're jumpy." Elarra scoffed softly, a sound devoid of humor. "They're always on edge when they lose something valuable. It just means they're distracted." "They're always jumpy," she corrected, a slight edge to her tone, a familiar impatience. "Better to be quick than to be caught dreaming." She motioned towards the narrow gap between two colossal iron storage tanks, a passage barely wide enough for a scrawny alley cat. "You go first. Distraction on the far side, then meet me at the grate." The air grew thick with the smell of stale oil and damp earth as Lyra melted into the shadows, a ghost amongst the grime. Elarra waited, counting the slow, heavy beats of her own heart, listening to the city's mournful sighs and distant creaks. Wonder if that old stray cat finally found a warm corner tonight. Her senses were heightened, every creak and distant shout a potential threat. A lone Imperial patrolman, his heavy boots echoing on the metal grating, passed by their hiding spot, his breath pluming in the cold air. Elarra held her breath, her hand resting on the cold, rough stone of the wall, the grit digging into her palm. The moment he turned the corner, she launched herself, a blur of motion through the narrow passage, her small frame surprisingly powerful as she squeezed through the tight space. A faint hunger pang twisted in her gut, a familiar ache quickly ignored. She reached the designated crate, her fingers already dancing over the intricate lock mechanism. It was a standard Imperial design, but the tumblers were stubborn, resisting her usual finesse. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the far side of the depot, Lyra's signal. Elarra winced, knowing it wouldn't buy them much time. "Damn it, Lyra, make it count." Her fingers worked faster, a desperate urgency fueling her movements. The lock clicked, then stubbornly refused to turn fully. Frustration fled, hot and sudden, a familiar burn. She pressed her thumb hard against the cold metal, a silent curse forming on her lips, the taste of rust suddenly sharp in her mouth. For a fleeting moment, a strange warmth bloomed beneath her skin, and the metal beneath her touch seemed to, well, give. The tumblers shifted, almost imperceptibly, and with a soft thunk the lock gave way. Elarra didn't question it. She didn't even register the peculiarity beyond a fleeting thought that she'd finally hit the sweet spot. Just a lucky break, I guess. She pulled the lid open, revealing a cache of high-quality Imperial rations. Enough to feed the guild for a week, she thought, a flicker of grim satisfaction. Swiftly, she began transferring the contents into her reinforced satchel. A harsh shout pierced the night, closer than it should have been. "Intruders, over here." Elarra's head snapped up, her heart lurching into a frantic rhythm. No, not like this. Not now, they'd been found. Too soon. Lyra appeared at the entrance to the alley, her eyes wide with alarm. "They're coming from both sides, Elarra, the main gate and the service tunnel." "No time for the grate," Elarra hissed, slinging the heavy satchel over her shoulder. "Through the pipe. Move!" She scrambled up the side of a rusted boiler, her calloused fingers finding purchase on every rivet and seam. Lyra was right behind her, a shadow mirroring her every move. They dropped into a narrow, dark culvert, the stench of stagnant water and waste assaulting their senses. Heavy bootfalls thudded above them, their voices muffled but menacing. They crawled, then ran, through the tangled passages beneath the city. Elarra could hear the Imperial Guardsmen gaining, their shouts echoing in the confined space. "We need to lose them," Lyra panted, stumbling slightly. "The old market tunnel, it's too far." Elarra pushed harder, her lungs burning, the weight of the satchel a constant drag, chafing her shoulder. She knew these tunnels, every hidden turn, every crumbling wall, or at least she used to. The Empire's patrols had grown more efficient, their reach extending even into these forgotten veins of the city, changing the familiar landscape into something treacherous and unknown. They burst into a wider, derelict section of the tunnels, once a forgotten subway line, now just a cavernous echo chamber. Ahead, a massive, rusted iron gate stood half open, but it was slowly grinding shut, its heavy chain groaning under the strain. Beyond it lay a tangle of disused ventilation shafts, their only escape. Behind them, the torchlight of the Imperial Guards flickered into view, their armor catching the light. "Elarra, it's closing," Lyra cried, her voice laced with despair. Elarra pushed, her muscles screaming, but the gate was too heavy, its mechanism too rusted, groaning like an old man. It was almost shut, a mere sliver of light remaining. The Imperial Guards were 20 paces behind them, their weapons drawn. "No," Elarra yelled, desperation a cold knot in her stomach. She slammed her open palm against the cold, unyielding iron of the gate, her mind screaming for it to move. And then it happened again. A jolt like static electricity surged through her hand into the gate. The heavy chain, already taut, seemed to vibrate, almost shiver, and with a sudden, ear-splitting screech of tortured metal, the gate lurched open a full foot. Just enough. "Barely." "Go," Elarra screamed, shoving Lyra through the gap. She squeezed through herself, the rough iron scraping her shoulder, just as the first Imperial Guard reached the gate, slamming against it with a frustrated roar. The gate shuttered, then slowly began to close again, the strange metallic shiver gone. They didn't stop running yet, as she picked up a discarded copper coin from the floor. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth seemed to radiate from it, a subtle hum she felt more than heard. She frowned, turning it over in her fingers, then squinted at it, as if that would reveal something. Nothing. Just an old coin. She tossed it back to the ground. Still, a tiny, unfamiliar prickle of curiosity, like a sliver of rust in a perfectly smooth gear, had lodged itself deep within her. She dismissed the feeling, but outside, the city's mournful symphony of metal and smoke seemed to shift, a low, almost imperceptible vibration joining its chorus. A faint, growing resonance that for some would be impossible to ignore. Chapter 3: A Shadow's Offer. The air, thick with coal smoke and damp earth, clung to Marcus like a second skin. From his vantage point atop a crumbling tenement, he watched the city's lower arteries thrum with a raw, desperate life. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, cut through the perpetual twilight, not searching for a face, but for a signature, a faint tremor in the city's iron bones. He followed the echoes of her small, unconscious disruptions for days now, a faint hum beneath the capital's industrial cacophony. It was a delicate dance, tracking a ghost in the shadows, but the whispers had grown stronger. He shifted, the grit of the ledge digging into his palm, a ripple of movement barely disturbing the dust. A pigeon cooed, startlingly loud, from a broken window nearby. Marcus ignored it, his gaze locked below. Below, the labyrinthine alleys teemed with the desperate and the cunning. His gaze caught a flash of movement, a figure darting between stalls, quick and light. Elarra. She moved with the lean, swift grace of a street cat, her movements efficient, almost invisible. He watched her hands, quick and almost imperceptible, as she navigated the crowded market. There was a subtle resonance, a faint, almost imperceptible ping in the back of his mind, whenever she brushed past a metal vendor's wares, a lock, a coin. It was there, just beneath the surface, a growing harmony. He knew he was close. The time for observation was drawing to a close. His stomach rumbled, a sharp reminder he hadn't eaten since dawn. Elarra's fingers danced over the rusted latch of the merchant's back gate, a desperate hope tightening in her gut. The market alley was quieter now, the last of the day's hawkers packing up their meager goods. Lyra, ever cautious, pressed herself against the grimy wall, her eyes scanning for Imperial patrols. "Are you sure about this, Elarra?" Lyra's voice was a low murmur, barely audible over the distant clang of the Imperial forges. "That merchant's got connections. And a temper, too, I hear." Elarra spared her a quick, confident glance. A cold knot of unease tightened in her own stomach, but she pushed it down. "He's also got a fresh shipment of alloyed copper wire, worth a week of rations for the guild, and his connections are too busy counting their own coin to notice a few missing spools." Her attention returned to the lock. It was stiff, stubborn, but as her fingers grazed its cold, pitted surface, she felt a familiar, almost imperceptible give. The tumblers seemed to sigh, shifting just enough. A trick of the light, she told herself, a lucky break. It always was. With a soft click, the gate swung open. They were inside, moving with practiced stealth. The air was thick with the smell of new metals and stale spices. And something else, faint, like burnt sugar. She pushed it aside, focusing on the task. They filled their satchels quickly, hands flying, efficient. Just as they turned to leave, a heavy boot struck the cobblestones outside. A patrol. Lyra froze, her breath catching, a tiny gasp escaping her lips. Elarra grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadows behind a stack of empty crates. The clatter of armor, the guttural voices of the Imperial Guard, grew louder. They held their breath, waiting, the copper wire pressing cold against their skin, a tangible weight of their gamble. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded, and the voices receded into the night. "Too close," Lyra whispered, her face pale in the dim light. Her eyes were wide with lingering fear. "Much too close." Elarra let out a slow breath, her heart still thrumming against her ribs. "That's how it always is, Lyra. Close, too close. But we live to fight another day, don't we?" She adjusted her satchel, the weight of the stolen metal a comforting heft. They melted back into the alleys, like wraiths in the city's perpetual twilight. Elarra emerged from the warren of back alleys onto a deserted side street, the stolen copper a satisfying weight in her bag. The street was narrow, flanked by shuttered shops and the skeletal remains of forgotten market stalls. She was about to cut across to a more familiar route when a figure stepped out from the deep shadows of an arched doorway, blocking her path. He was tall, lean, and his silhouette seemed to absorb the meager light. His face was a map of harsh lines and old scars, his eyes glinting like dark pebbles in the gloom. Elarra's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the small knife tucked into her belt. She'd faced Imperial guards with less trepidation, and those usually came in threes. This man was different. He moved with a quiet authority, a stillness that made Elarra's instincts scream danger. "A successful night, it seems," the man said, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly calm. "Copper, if I'm not mistaken, a good haul." Elarra's jaw tightened. "Who are you? And what business is it of yours?" She took a step back, her senses on high alert. No one knew about her hauls, not really, not with this kind of precision. He offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "My business, little shadow, is with the way metal sings to you, the way it whispers when you're near." A cold knot formed in Elarra's stomach. He couldn't possibly know. The subtle shifts, the lucky breaks, she'd always dismissed them as coincidence, a trick of the mind, a desperate hope. No one had ever seen. "You don't know what you're talking about," she spat, trying to inject venom into her voice, but a tremor of fear laced her words. His gaze was unwavering, piercing. "Oh, I know. I've heard it sung myself, though mine is a different tune. Yours, Elarra, is a symphony waiting to be played. A full Smith symphony." He paused, letting the words hang in the still, heavy air. "You've been touching the world, shifting it without even knowing. Locks bending, coins hovering, the subtle give of a pipe. Don't tell me you haven't noticed." The world seemed to lurch, a sickening drop in her gut. He spoke of things she'd buried deep, dismissed as impossible, as madness. The sudden, inexplicable ease with certain mechanisms, the fleeting sensation of metal responding to her will. The phrase "full smith" meant nothing to her, yet the weight of his words, the uncanny accuracy of his observation, sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. It felt like a confession she hadn't known she was making. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper this time. "What is a full smith?" "My name is Elarra." Stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of suspicion, fear, and a terrifying, exhilarating spark of curiosity. The offer was audacious, insane. This man was either a madman or something far more dangerous. Yet the words, "shatter the chains," resonated in a place she hadn't known existed. She wanted to scoff, to dismiss him, to run. But the image of the Emperor's metal-clad guards, the perpetual gloom, the endless struggle for scraps, it all flashed before her. The constant hunger, the gnawing fear of the patrols, the ache in her bones from a lifetime of scrabbling. Could there truly be another way? She took another step back, then another, the deeper shadows of the alley beckoning. But her feet, usually so quick to flee danger, felt rooted. The weight of his words pressed down, heavier than any copper she'd ever stolen, heavier than the very sky the Emperor had claimed. A chilling dread wad with a desperate, burning hope. Was this a trap, or was it the only way out of a life that was already a slow, grinding death? She didn't look back, but she didn't melt away either. She stood there, poised on the knife edge of decision, the city's metallic hum now a siren's song in her ears. Marcus watched her, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. He hadn't expected her to accept immediately, but he knew the gnawing hunger of the Undercity, the suffocating weight of the Emperor's rule. The seed was planted, yes, but more than that, the hook was set. He felt the nascent power stirring within her, a faint, rhythmic thrum beneath the city's surface, calling to something deeper. He waited. Chapter 4: The Forge of Secrets. The biting wind of the upper city yielded to the stagnant, humid air of the underlevels as Elarra followed Marcus. Each turn deeper into the twisting passages felt like a descent into a subterranean realm, utterly unlike the gritty clamor of the slums. Her hand instinctively sought the hidden knife at her hip, the cold steel a small comfort against the gnawing dread that tightened in her gut. This wasn't a street deal, not a quick snatch and grab. This felt like a plunge into something vast, inescapable. A low, resonant thrum seemed to emanate from deeper within. Finally, a heavy, unmarked door, cleverly disguised, swung inward. Elarra froze, a sharp intake of breath catching in her throat. Ancient tools lay scattered on scarred workbenches. Strange alloys glinted in the flickering lamplight. The air itself hummed, a low thrum that vibrated in her teeth, thick with the scent of ozone and old iron. It was nothing like the cramped, familiar dens of the thieves' guild. Marcus stepped in, his silhouette framed by the strange glow. Elarra hesitated on the threshold, her eyes dotting, assessing every shadow, every glint of metal. She noticed a faint, almost iridescent sheen on a pile of filings near one bench, probably nothing, just dust. He didn't rush her, simply waited, a silent invitation that felt more like a challenge. "This is where you learn to listen," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with the very metals around them. He gestured to a rough-hewn table piled with various rocks and dull metal ingots. "Feel it, not with your hands but with something deeper, the pulse of the earth, the song of the metal within." Elarra let out a short, dismissive puff of air, trying to mask her nerves with bravado. She picked up a chunk of ore, her fingers tracing its cold, unyielding surface. Nothing. She squeezed it, willing something to happen, but it remained stubbornly inert. What a waste of time. Her gaze drifted to the ancient, soot-stained walls, then back to Marcus, a flicker of impatience in her eyes. This was supposed to be a job, not some mystic mumbo-jumbo. What was he playing at? Marcus watched, unblinking, from across their makeshift training ground. He picked up a small, dull silver wire, and with a barely perceptible twitch of his wrist, the wire seemed to ripple. It twisted into a delicate knot before straightening itself out. Elarra's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine awe cutting through her practiced cynicism. How? Marcus cut her off. Focus, it's not a trick. It's an extension of yourself. A stubborn spark ignited within her, a challenge she couldn't ignore. She picked up a thin copper plate, her fingers still cool from the underground air. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind as Marcus had instructed. For a moment there was nothing but the thrum of her own pulse. Then a faint warmth, a subtle shift. The copper plate in her hand seemed to flex, almost imperceptibly, before settling back into its original shape. It was so slight she almost missed it. But Marcus didn't. Good, he murmured, a rare hint of satisfaction in his voice. Again. She tried again, pushing harder, trying to replicate that fleeting connection. The warmth returned, stronger this time, not just in her hands, but spreading through her arms, a tingling sensation like 1,000 tiny pins. It was too much, too fast. An unfamiliar energy surged, a raw, untamed force. It felt like her bones were being struck by 1,000 tiny hammers, her blood boiling in her veins. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath as the copper plate vibrated violently, then shot from her grasp, embedding itself with a sharp thwack into the stone wall. Simultaneously, a low rumble echoed through the workshop, a shudder that rattled the very foundations, sending tools clattering to the floor. Marcus, caught off guard, stumbled, grabbing a heavy anvil to steady himself, his eyes wide with a mixture of alarm and grudging respect. "Elarra," he barked, his voice laced with concern. A shock jolted through her, a dizzying blend of terror and exhilaration. She had done that, gods above. She had felt it. The tremor subsided, leaving an unnerving silence, broken only by the settling dust and the distant drip of water. The air, thick with the scent of metal, seemed to press in. Marcus approached her slowly, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the embedded copper plate. "That," he said, his voice low, "is just a taste of what you are. A full smith." He then turned to a hidden alcove, pulling back a heavy canvas. Intricate diagrams, etched into ancient metal, gleamed beneath. Beside them, a crude map of the empire. "For 2 centuries," he began, his voice dropping to a grave tone, "the Steel Emperor has ruled. Not just by force, but by a dark metal alchemy that sustains his life. It siphons the very essence from the land and its people." Elarra listened, her initial skepticism warring with the undeniable power she had just unleashed. A strange, almost childish urge to scratch her nose flickered through her, but she resisted, trying to maintain her hardened composure. Marcus's gaze drifted to the etched diagrams, his jaw tightening. Your kind, the full smiths, were the only ones who could stand against him. Protectors, healers, masters of all metals. He paused, a ghost of memory in his eyes, until the Black Mountain uprising. His voice grew distant, haunted. The Emperor hunted them down, purged them. It was a massacre. He feared their power more than anything. A cold dread settled over Elarra. The pieces were starting to click into place, a terrifying knot of her own unexplained abilities and a hidden lineage tightening in her gut. She remembered the strange dreams, the inexplicable urges. Marcus's jaw tightened further, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at the map, then back at her, his eyes shadowed. "I was there," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I lost everything." A flicker of something akin to pity, alien and unwelcome, stirred in Elarra's chest, a strange warmth she immediately tried to suppress. Pity was a weakness she couldn't afford. "My family," Marcus finally said, his gaze meeting hers, raw and unfiltered. They died at Black Mountain, crushed under imperial steel because we weren't strong enough. I wasn't strong enough. The weight of his words, the sheer depth of his loss, settled heavily in the silent Facade, a physical pressure in the humid air. Elarra looked around at the ancient tools, the strange metals, the embedded copper plate, tangible proof of a power she barely understood, a power that had cost so much. The cynicism that had been her shield for so long began to crack, not just in her mind, but a cold, unsettling tremor that spread from her gut to the very floor beneath her feet. It was replaced by a chilling awareness of the true, brutal stakes, a nascent, wild energy stirring not just within her, but resonating through the metal heart of the Facade itself. The workshop, once a place of mere curiosity, now felt like a crucible, a place where she would either break or be reforged. The choice was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy, vengeance, and a burden she was only just beginning to comprehend. Chapter 5, Whispers of Steel. A whisper, faint as the sigh of cooling iron, stirred the ancient calm of the Steel Emperor's chambers. He sat on a throne carved from black stone and dark steel, his gaze, usually fixed on the distant, smoke-veiled horizon, now turned inward. A tremor, almost imperceptible, had brushed the vast metallic network woven beneath his city. It was a pulse he had cultivated and controlled for 2 centuries. This was no familiar hum of the forges, nor the rhythmic thrum of the mining operations. This was a nascent, wild energy, a discordant note in his carefully composed symphony of steel. A figure, tall and imposing even in the Emperor's shadowed presence, stepped forward. Commander Valerius, his armor gleaming dully, bowed with crisp precision. "Your Majesty," he rumbled, his voice a low murmur against the Emperor's silence. A faint draught snaked through the cavernous room, making Valerius subtly shift his weight, a practiced, almost unconscious adjustment to the chill. The Emperor's voice, like 2 plates of earth shifting, finally broke the quiet. "A disturbance, Valerius, a flicker in the metal heart of my city." His eyes, cold as forged steel, narrowed. "Find the sauce." Discreetly. He paused, the silence stretching, heavy with unspoken command. "I do not wish for widespread panic, nor do I wish this anomaly to grow unchecked." Valerius's spine stiffened. A tremor in the city's metallic pulse was no small matter. The Emperor's connection to the very foundations of the Iron Empire was, after all, legendary. He saluted, the crisp sound echoing. "It shall be done, Your Majesty." As Valerius turned to leave, a cold certainty settled in his gut. The sovereign was rarely wrong about such things. He wondered, briefly, if he'd make it home before the next shift change, a fleeting thought of his wife's warm hand in his, quickly suppressed. Duty called. Deep beneath the city, in Marcus's hidden forge, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and heated metal. Sparks danced from Marcus's calloused hands as he demonstrated, bending a thick iron bar with a focused grunt, his movements quick and efficient. Elarra watched, her brow furrowed in concentration, a thin copper wire held loosely between her fingers. "You must listen," Marcus urged, his voice raspy. "Feel the grain, the memory of the earth within it. It's not about force, Elarra. It's about persuasion." She closed her eyes, trying to block out the rhythmic clang of distant imperial patrols, the phantom ache in her muscles from hours of practice. All she felt was the cold, unyielding metal. "It's just metal," she muttered, her frustration mounting. "It doesn't talk to me." She tried to recall the fleeting moments of luck she'd had in the slums, the locks that warped, the coins that paused, defying gravity for a breath. But here, under Marcus's intense gaze, surrounded by the raw power of the forge, it felt impossible. She absently traced a scotch mark on the dark rock wall that looked vaguely like a snarling dog, a small, humanizing detail in the oppressive space. Marcus sighed, a sound like escaping steam. It whispers, Elarra, always, you're just shouting over it. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle, a rare moment of softness from the gruff man. Forget what you want it to do. Ask it what it wants to do. All metal desires to be shaped, to flow, to become. Elarra grit her teeth, a spark of defiance igniting within her. She wouldn't be defeated by a piece of copper. She focused, not on the wire itself, but on the very essence of metal around her. The iron beams supporting the forge, the tools hanging on the walls, the faint metallic tang in the air. A faint warmth spread through her fingertips, a subtle vibration that resonated deep within her bones. It was like a raw, untamed symphony, each metal a different instrument, playing a low, continuous chord. That's it, Marcus let out a shaky breath, his eyes wide with a fearful wonder. The copper wire in Elarra's hand began to hum, a faint, almost musical sound. It stretched, elongating, then twisted into an intricate spiral, all without her conscious command. Elarra gasped, her eyes snapping open. What was that? The wire, now a delicate helix, pulsed with a soft, internal light. It felt alive, a miniature storm contained within her palm. Marcus looked at her, his jaw tight, his gaze a mix of awe and burgeoning dread. That, Elarra, was a taste of what you truly are. He picked up a small, dull iron ingot. Now try to feel the iron, its weight, its density, its stubbornness. She took the ingot, her fingers tingling. The previous sensation was still fresh, a ghost of power humming beneath her skin. She closed her eyes again, pushing past the initial frustration, past the skepticism. She reached for that deeper hum, that symphony of metals. She felt the iron, heavy and resistant, but also tired, worn. It wanted to be free of its current form, to yield. A low rumble started, not from the ingot, but from the very ground beneath her feet. The forge lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. Marcus's eyes snapped to the ceiling, then back to Elarra, alarm etched on his face. Elarra, stop, he yelled, but his voice was swallowed by a sudden, violent shake. The iron ingot in her hand began to vibrate violently, glowing with an intense, internal heat. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ancient stone walls of the forge, dust and small rocks raining down. A heavy metal beam overhead groaned, threatening to buckle. Elarra cried out, a raw mix of terror and exhilarating fear tearing through her. The power surged through her, uncontrolled, a raging river of metallic energy threatening to tear the forge apart, threatening to tear her apart. With a final, shattering groan, the tremor subsided, leaving behind a silence so profound it was deafening. The forge stood, but barely. Half the lights were out, and a fine layer of dust coated everything, shimmering in the remaining light. The iron ingot in Elarra's hand was now a shapeless, molten blob, cooling rapidly, its internal light fading to a dull red. Elarra stared at her hands, trembling. What did I do? Her voice was barely a whisper, laced with a fear that went deeper than the physical damage to the forge. This wasn't just power, it was destruction, raw, untamed. Could she wield something so wild, so dangerous, without becoming a monster herself? The thought chilled her to the bone. Marcus approached her slowly, a deep relief warring with a new, profound dread on his face. You woke it up, he said, his voice hushed. The full Smith power. And the Emperor felt it. He looked around the damaged forge, the splintered stone, the buckled beams, then back to Elarra, his eyes grim. We don't have as much time as I thought. His gaze hardened, sweeping past the wreckage to a hidden recess in the wall. The Emperor's awareness had just forced their hand. The time for caution was over. He reached into the alcove, his fingers closing around a small, intricately worked piece of metal. It's time, Elarra, tonight. Chapter 6, A Heist for Hope. The air in Marcus's hidden forge hummed with a different kind of tension that morning. It wasn't the familiar thrum of metalwork, but a heavy, almost brittle anticipation. Marcus stood before Elarra, a rare, intricate metal fragment clutched in his hand, glinting dimly. His voice, usually a low rumble, was clipped, precise. The weight of their nascent revolution pressed on every syllable. A knot tightened in Elarra's stomach, a mixture of apprehension and a strange, thrilling surge of readiness. This wasn't another training exercise. This was real. He outlined the target, an imperial supply depot notorious for its heavy guard and labyrinthine layout. The fragment he held, he explained, was a crucial component. Not just rare, but forged with a specific, almost arcane alloy vital for his larger, still unspoken plan. "This isn't about survival anymore, Elarra," Marcus stated, his gaze piercing. "This is about hope. And failure here means we lose more than just a piece of metal." Cold dread trickled down Elarra's spine, a momentary paralysis. For a beat, she felt it threaten to root her to the spot, a sudden, heavy anchor. Then, slowly, a stubborn, hot resolve began to push back against the chill. She would not fail. She couldn't. Her hands, already reaching for her gear, moved with a fluid, practiced grace, a whisper of her street thief days. As the critical hour approached, a quiet, almost grim determination settled over her. The city's shadows stretched long, deepening into a hazy, smoke-tinged twilight. Elarra found herself pressed against the cold, grimy wall of the Imperial Supply Depot. The rough stones scraped her cheek, a familiar discomfort that grounded her. The fortress loomed, a hulking silhouette of reinforced steel and flickering searchlights, a brute declaration of imperial power. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden god, every metallic clang from within a warning. She took a deep breath, the acrid air burning her lungs, and began her approach. Her fingers, nimble and practiced, worked a complex locking mechanism on a side gate. A faint hum resonated through the metal as she subtly coaxed the tumblers, her newfound power a quiet, almost physical extension of her will. The interior of the depot was a dizzying maze of stacked crates and towering shelves. The rhythmic clank of unseen machinery echoed, a constant pulse. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and old iron, and something else, faintly sweet, like burnt sugar. Elarra moved, a whisper among whispers, her senses heightened. Every creak and groan of the metal around her became a potential threat or opportunity. A patrol rounded a corner ahead, the heavy boots echoing on the concrete. Elarra paused, her stomach giving a small, unexpected growl. She ignored it. Without breaking stride, she focused. A distant stack of empty metal barrels suddenly toppled with a deafening crash, drawing the guards away. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched her lips. This new power, combined with her old skills, exhilarated her. She navigated the maze, following the faint, almost imperceptible metallic signature Marcus had described, a unique resonance that hummed only for her. Finally, she located the specific crate, nestled deep within a secure vault. With a silent, precise flick of her wrist, the heavy steel latches unclasped, revealing the dull, unassuming fragment within. As Elarra carefully secured the fragment, a low, rhythmic clanking from a nearby, dimly lit alcove caught her attention. Curiosity, a dangerous companion, pulled her closer. There, hunched over a small, crude workbench, was an old man. His hands, scarred and calloused, meticulously shaped a piece of copper. His clothes were threadbare, his face etched with the deep lines of quiet suffering, the unmistakable marks of enslavement. His eyes, rheumy with age and sorrow, met hers. In that shared, silent moment, a flicker of understanding passed between them. He fumbled in his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and pressed a small, intricately carved copper bird into her palm. It was crude, yet beautiful, a tiny, defiant thing, a fragile symbol of something Elarra couldn't quite name. Elarra's heart ached, a sharp, unfamiliar pain. She could help him. She could probably even create a diversion for his escape. But it would jeopardize everything Marcus had planned, everything they were fighting for. The weight of the fragment in her pouch suddenly felt insignificant compared to the tiny bird in her hand, still warm from his grasp. The choice felt impossible, a cruel twist of the knife. Before she could make a choice, the sharp, metallic clang of imperial boots echoed from the main corridor, closer this time. The old artisan's eyes widened in terror. He glanced at the bird in her hand, then back at her, a silent, desperate plea that tore at her. Two imperial guards burst into the alcove, their polished armor gleaming menacingly. They roughly seized the artisan, ignoring his whimper, dragging him away without a second glance at Elarra, who had pressed herself against the deepest shadows. The image of his pleading eyes, the way his frail body crumpled under their grip, burned itself into her mind. A cold, unsettling rage ignited within her, settling deep in her bones. This wasn't just a mission anymore, it was personal. She clutched the copper bird, its cool metal now radiating a strange, internal heat against her skin, and moved. The path ahead was fraught, yet the objective remained clear. Elarra moved through the depot with a renewed, almost desperate urgency, her movements precise, almost unnaturally fluid. The metallic cacophony of the depot now felt like a mocking chorus, each clang a fresh reminder of the artisan's capture. She was out, scrambling over a perimeter wall, the cold night air a stark contrast to the simmering fury in her gut. The fragment was safe, but the cost, the personal cost, felt immense. She returned to Marcus's forge, the silence there a stark contrast to the depot's chaos. Marcus looked up as she entered, his eyes scanning her for injuries. He saw the fragment, then his gaze fell on the copper bird still clutched in her hand. Elarra recounted the mission, her voice tight, omitting nothing, especially the artisan's capture. She watched his face, expecting judgment, perhaps even a lecture about priorities. Instead, a flicker of something akin to sorrow crossed his features. He picked up the copper bird, turning it over in his calloused fingers. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, a heavy understanding of the lives they fought for and the ones they couldn't save. The mission was a success, the crucial components secured. But for Elarra, the true heist had been of her heart, now irrevocably bound to the suffering of the oppressed. As for the Empire, her daring intrusion, the strange, almost too clean breaches left in her wake, would not be dismissed as common thievery. This was only the beginning, and the tremors of her actions were already spreading. Chapter 7, The Emperor's Shadow. Commander Valerius moved with quiet, almost predatory efficiency. His polished boots crunched faintly on the scorched metal floor of the Imperial supply depot. The air still carried the acrid tang of ozone and burnt wiring, a lingering reminder of the night's unwelcome intrusion. His gloved fingers traced the edge of a severed conduit, noting the unnatural twist in the steel. This was no ordinary cut. A ripple of something beyond mere thievery, a signature he couldn't quite place, made his jaw tighten. He felt a familiar prickle of unease, a sensation he rarely trusted. He knelt, examining a series of sheared bolts that had once secured a reinforced door. The break was clean, too clean for a conventional explosive, yet not sharp enough to be a blade. Instead, the metal around the rupture showed a subtle, almost organic ripple, as if it had been coaxed to yield. A cold certainty began to settle in his gut, a shiver he almost dismissed as the depot's lingering chill. This was not the work of common thieves, not even the crude sabotage of desperate rebels. This was something else entirely, something he'd only seen hinted at in ancient, forbidden texts, whispers of forgotten powers. He retrieved a small, specialized kit from his belt, carefully bagging a shard of the warped steel and taking meticulous measurements of the affected areas. Every detail was crucial, every anomaly a clue to a power the Empire had long believed eradicated. He knew his report would be met with skepticism, perhaps even ridicule, but the evidence, cold and metallic in his hand, was undeniable. Hours later, Valerius, his throat dry and his uniform smelling faintly of burnt metal, stood before the Steel Emperor. The throne room was a cavernous space, clad in dark, unyielding stone. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that always clung to the Emperor's presence. "Commander Valerius, you requested an audience. Speak." The Emperor's voice, though low, resonated with an ancient power that seemed to press down on the very bones of the room, making Valerius's ears ache. Valerius bowed, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on a point just above the Emperor's head. "My Emperor, the supply depot has been breached. Significant losses were sustained, primarily of the specially alloyed fragments you commissioned." A dismissive flick of the Emperor's hand, adorned with rings of dark, heavy metal. "A nuisance. The rabble grows bolder." "Double the patrols, Valerius." "My Emperor," Valerius pressed, his voice unwavering, though he felt a slight catch in his throat. He risked a glance at the Emperor's shadowed face. This was no ordinary breach. The methods employed, they defy conventional explanation. The metal itself was manipulated, not merely broken. "I found traces, subtle yet undeniable, of what could only be described as an iron weaver's touch, though far more refined than any I have ever encountered." The Emperor's eyes, which had been half-lidded, snapped open, glinting like polished steel. A subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around his ancient features hinted at dangerous intrigue, quickly masked. "An iron weaver, you say?" After all this time? The Emperor's voice was a whisper now, yet it filled the vast chamber, echoing off the dark walls. "Show me your evidence, Commander. Describe every detail of this." Refinement. Valerius presented his findings, acutely aware of the shift in the Emperor's demeanor, the sudden, predatory focus. A cold shiver traced his spine. This was no longer a routine investigation. "Find this individual, Valerius. Bring them to me, intact. And if they resist, ensure their capture is swift and absolute. No expense is too great." The Emperor's command, though quiet, left no room for doubt. Valerius bowed again, a cold dread settling in his heart. The weight of the task felt suddenly immense. He turned and marched from the throne room, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him, sealing him in the Emperor's grim resolve. Far below the city, where the rumble of imperial transports was a distant, almost forgotten hum, the air in Marcus's hidden base was thick with the scent of aged leather and raw metal. Elarra paced, her fingers worrying a loose thread on her tunic, her energy a nervous hum. She knew Marcus had something momentous to share. The gravity in his eyes was unmistakable. "Elarra," Marcus began, his voice low but firm, "the time for small movements is over. The Emperor senses a disturbance. We have his attention. Now we must strike at the heart of his power." He unrolled a massive, intricately detailed map across a workbench, revealing a schematic of the imperial palace, its labyrinthine passages and fortified layers. "Our target isn't the Emperor himself, not yet. It's his lifeblood, the alchemical chamber. It lies deep beneath the palace, fueled by dark rituals and ancient metal magic that sustains his immortality. Your power, Elarra, is the only key." He pointed to a series of heavily guarded access points, then traced a path through hidden conduits and forgotten service tunnels. "We will use your ability to bypass the metallic wards, to silence the senses, to turn their own defenses against them. Once inside, you will disrupt the flow, shatter the core of his alchemy." Elarra stared at the map, her breath catching in her throat. The sheer audacity, the impossible scale of it, made her feel small and insignificant, like a speck of dust on a grand, terrifying blueprint. She wondered, briefly, if they had any decent bread down here, before the thought vanished under the sudden weight of Marcus's words. Infiltrate the palace? Disrupt his immortality? Marcus, you speak of suicide. No one has ever gotten close to that chamber, let alone escaped. Marcus met her gaze, his own filled with a grim resolve. The risks are immeasurable. Sacrifices will be made. He paused, his gaze distant for a moment, as if seeing ghosts. But what is the alternative, Elarra? To live forever in his shadow, to watch our people toil and die for his endless reign. A fierce, desperate spark ignited within Elarra, battling the cold grip of her fear. The image of the enslaved artisan, the copper bird, flashed in her mind. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about something larger, something that clawed at her conscience. Then Marcus took a deep breath, his next words delivered with a quiet intensity that cut through the air. There is something else you must know, Elarra. Something I should have told you sooner, but the timing had to be right. Your mother, she was a full smith. Like you. The words hit Elarra like Marcus's words were a heavy mantle, settling upon her shoulders. Elarra stared at the map of the imperial palace, the immense, impossible challenge ahead pressing down on her. A silent, fierce commitment hardened her resolve, but it was a resolve now weighted by a truth too vast to keep. The intricate lines of the palace seemed to shift, no longer just a blueprint of an enemy's stronghold, but a path to justice, a legacy to reclaim. There was no turning back, no retreat from the destiny that had been laid bare before her. The Emperor's shadow stretched long, but Elarra knew she carried a light that could burn it away. A light that also illuminated the daunting task of sharing this impossible burden with the one person who mattered most. Chapter 8, Cracks in the Facade. The new knowledge, Marcus's revelations about her mother and the true nature of the Emperor's reign, felt like a lead weight in Elarra's gut. The flickering oil lamp in their shed den cast long, dancing shadows, making her own secrets feel vast and dangerous. Too heavy to keep from the one person who mattered most. Lyra, her fingers still stained with the day's grime from a particularly unlucky scavenging run, hummed a tuneless melody. She meticulously sorted through a small pile of salvaged copper wire, her movements easy, familiar. Elarra's hands, usually nimble and warm, felt cold and clumsy in her lap. She found herself wondering if the old woman who sold spiced nuts near the market was still there. She hadn't had a good one in weeks. The normalcy of it all felt like a lie, a thin veil over a churning abyss. Elarra took a deep, shaky breath, the metallic tang of the city's air sharp in her lungs. Lyra, she began, her voice a little rougher than she intended. There's something I need to tell you. Lyra paused, her head cocked. A flicker of concern replaced her usual easygoing expression. What is it? Did that old rat-catcher finally try to take a bite out of you? Elarra shook her head, the words catching in her throat. Explaining the impossible, the truly unbelievable, felt like trying to force a boulder through a keyhole. The words felt too big, too absurd for her mouth. She recounted the tale, stumbling over details, her voice cracking as she described the hidden forge, the strange, undeniable power that hummed beneath her skin. Lyra's initial reaction wasn't just disbelief. It was a tight, angry scoff. Then, a flicker of genuine confusion, her eyes widening as Elarra spoke of metal bending to her will. Wait, Lyra cut in, holding up a grimy hand. Her brow furrowed. You're telling me, she scoffed, though the usual bite had softened in her tone, that you've been sneaking off with some old man, and he's convinced you that you can, what? Make spoons dance. A nervous laugh escaped her, but it quickly died as she saw the grim set of Elarra's jaw. Their argument simmered, punctuated by the incessant, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaking copper pipe that had plagued their den for weeks. Elarra could feel the pipe's weakness, a silent hum of distress that resonated with her own frustration. A dull throb, a quiet failure of the metal, echoed the ache in Elarra's own bones. Without conscious thought, driven by a desperate need for Lyra to understand, Elarra extended a hand, her gaze fixed on the corroded seam. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiated from her fingertips. The dripping slowed, then stopped entirely. The pipe, once visibly cracked, now showed a faint, dull sheen where the metal had simply closed, like a wound healing over. Lyra stared, her jaw slack. The salvaged copper wire tumbled from her numb fingers, scattering across the floor. She reached out, touching the now dry pipe with a tentative finger, then looked at Elarra. Her eyes held a mixture of terror and awe. A small, dark beetle, disturbed by the sudden silence, scuttled out from behind the pipe and disappeared into a crack in the wall. "What, how?" Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. The truth, raw and impossible, had finally broken through her cynicism, leaving her breathless. The silence that followed wasn't profound. It was simply there, thick and suffocating, filled with the terrifying implications of Elarra's power. Lyra's gaze, when it finally met hers, held a new, fragile kind of trust. The silence stretched, then broke as Lyra finally nodded, a slow, shaky movement. With that silent support, a new resolve hardened within Elarra. The secret, once a burden, now felt like a shared strength, a weight distributed between them. Marcus's training intensified, not just in manipulating metal, but in understanding the fractured politics of the slums. He guided her, not with commands, but with questions, pushing her to see the connections, to understand the grievances that simmered beneath the surface of the Empire's oppression. Elarra began to move through the shadows of the capital with a newfound purpose, her reputation as a resourceful thief subtly shifting. Word spread through the hidden channels and whispered networks of the dispossessed, drawing disparate groups of malcontents and freedom seekers to a clandestine meeting place beneath the city's oldest market. Elarra stood before them, a nervous tremor in her gut, but her gaze was steady. The faces before her were a jumble of the slums, weathered artisans, hardened former miners, quick-fingered guild members like herself. Each face told a story of hardship, a life etched with struggle. Yet, in their wary eyes, Elarra saw a flicker of shared defiance. Her voice, usually sharp and quick, took on a new resonance. She spoke not of grand ideals, but of tangible injustices, of the copper bird, of the shared weight of the chains. She spoke of Marcus, of a plan, of a chance not just to survive, but to truly fight back. Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction, they listened, their wary eyes assessing her, their hopes rekindling. The newly unified rebel network, energized by a sense of collective purpose, began to hum with activity. Scraps of information, once hoarded or dismissed, now flowed freely, piecing together a darker picture of the Emperor's intentions. A whispered rumor about troop movements here, a coded message, the news of the impending purification, was a chilling promise of new atrocities. A terrible target, yes, but also a stark, immediate call to action. Elarra's gaze found Marcus across the flickering light, a silent understanding passing between them. Lyra was counting on her, yes, but so were all these desperate faces, the hope a fragile, burning ember in the gloom. The path was clear, however perilous, deep into the iron vein mines. And she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that her unique gift, the very thing she'd tried to hide, was their only hope of getting inside. There was no more time for hesitation. The tunnels awaited. Chapter 9, The Heart of the Empire. The stale, metallic tang of ancient earth clung to the air, a scent now all too familiar to Elarra in these hidden passages beneath the capital. Marcus moved with a quiet, practiced grace ahead of her, his shadow a solid, reassuring presence in the gloom. He paused, hand raised. Elarra instinctively froze, her heart thrumming against her ribs. "We're nearing the outer perimeter," Marcus murmured, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the silence. "The Emperor's engineers are clever, but they've never faced a full smith before." Elarra scanned the rough-hewn tunnel walls, feeling the faint, almost imperceptible hum of hidden mechanisms. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to disappear into the shadows she knew, to vanish. But the memory of Lyra's fearful eyes, of the enslaved artisan's small copper bird, propelled her forward. They emerged into a larger, more finished corridor. The air here was colder, laced with polished steel and faint ozone. The sheer scale of it hit her then, a sudden, oppressive weight. She shivered, though not entirely from the chill. A massive, ornate gate, etched with imperial symbols, barred their path. Its surface gleamed, a dense lattice of metallic sensors covering every inch. "This is where your gift truly begins to shine," Marcus said, a rare glint of pride in his eyes. Elarra took a deep breath, reaching out with her mind. She felt the cold, complex network of the gate's internal workings. It was like a vast, sleeping beast, and she needed to wake it, gently, without causing a roar. She wondered if the Emperor ever felt the cold of his own metal, or if he was too far removed from the world he built. A faint, almost musical whine resonated through the metal. Bolts retracted, gears spun silently, and the immense gate began to slide open, revealing another, equally imposing passage beyond. Elarra's fingers, she noticed, were numb with cold. They moved swiftly through the newly opened path. Elarra's focus was now keenly attuned to the faint thrum of the palace's inner workings. She felt the minute shift in the floor plates, the faint electromagnetic fields that spoke of hidden tripwires and precious senses. Marcus watched her, a silent, steady presence, ready to act if her concentration wavered. They bypassed a series of surveillance grates, their lenses subtly warped by Elarra's touch, rendering them blind. An alarm panel was sealed before it could even register their presence. Each successful bypass fueled a quiet hum of confidence within her, a growing understanding of the sheer power she wielded. The air grew heavier, the silence more oppressive as they ventured deeper into the palace's outer rings. The quiet here was different, weighted, as if absorbing all sound. A distant clang echoed, then the rhythmic, heavy tread of armored boots. Marcus's hand shot out, pulling Elarra into the narrow recess of a shadowed archway just as a patrol of imperial guards rounded the corner. Their armor, polished to a dark sheen, seemed to drink the meager light, their faces obscured by grim, visored helms. Elarra's eyes snagged on a small, almost imperceptible scratch near the temple of one visor. A tiny imperfection in a facade of cold, lethal efficiency. Her breath hitched, a cold dread seizing her. She'd only ever seen them from a distance, never truly had to fight. "Stay hidden," Marcus whispered, his hand resting lightly on her arm. A silent command, clear as any shout. But one of the guards, his helmet turning slowly, seemed to catch a flicker of movement, or perhaps a faint shimmer in the air around Elarra. "Halt! Who goes there?" the guard commander barked, his voice echoing menacingly. Elarra flinched, a tiny, involuntary jerk. Before Marcus could react, the guards were advancing, blasters raised. Her mind raced, a knot of fear tightening, but beneath it, a burgeoning, unfamiliar rage began to burn. She saw the cold, unfeeling metal of their weapons, the stock efficiency of their movements, and a memory flashed. The enslaved artisan, his face etched with despair. This wasn't just about her survival anymore, was it? A raw, primal scream tore through her, though no sound escaped her lips. Just a gasp, maybe, a silent explosion of will. The very air around her shimmered. The floor beneath the approaching gods buckled, sending them stumbling. Their blaster rifles twisted in their hands, barrels whopping, firing wildly into the ceiling. Armor plates groaned, separating from their fastenings, binding limbs, forcing the gods to their knees with a terrible slowness. It was brutal. Efficient, terrifying, a cold, hard truth of her power. Elarra felt a jolt of exhilaration, quickly followed by a sickening lurch in her stomach. She watched the men struggle, trapped in their own mangled gear. It was a messy, ugly thing. "Elarra, we need to go," Marcus urged, pulling her away from the stunned, incapacitated gods. Her hands trembled, but her eyes, wide and almost feral, burned with a new, fierce light. A light that felt like a brand seared onto her very soul. She had crossed a line, embraced a violence she hadn't known she possessed. The taste of it was both bitter and intoxicating, a truth that settled deep in her bones. This, she realized, was where true power resided, not in grand pronouncements, but in the swift, brutal application of will. They pressed on, the silence of the inner palace now broken only by their own hurried breathing. The air grew colder still, raising goosebumps on Elarra's arms. Each corridor seemed grander, more imposing than the last, leading them deeper into the heart of the Emperor's domain. Finally, they reached a colossal antechamber. Its walls were not of cut stone, but of a seamless, dark metal, throbbing with a faint, unseen energy. It felt alive somehow. In the center, a vast, intricate network of interlocking metallic plates, glowing with an internal, pulsing light, covered an enormous archway. It was clearly a warding system, unlike anything Elarra had ever encountered. Marcus had called it ancient, yet it felt utterly alien. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice hushed with a grim respect. He cleared his throat, a small human sound in the vast chamber. The final barrier, the Emperor's personal shield, an ancient wad woven with dark alchemy. Elarra reached out. Her senses were immediately overwhelmed by the sheer density of the metal, the complex, almost living energy within it. It felt like trying to drink from a waterfall, a deluge of raw power. This wasn't just metal. It was woven with something else, something dark and sinister, like a twisted, metallic soul. This wasn't merely a lock to be picked. It was a fortress of pure will, ancient and unyielding. The barrier pulsed, a low, arrogant thrumming that seemed to mock their very presence. It was a challenge, a sneer made manifest in dark alchemy and cold steel. But Elarra was a full smith, and this ancient, malevolent will was about to meet one far stronger. Her fingers twitched, already feeling the intricate weave, preparing to unravel its centuries of defiance. Chapter 10: The Emperor's Altar. The air thrummed with a low, grinding hum, the cacophony of ancient wads fighting against the impossible. Elarra focused, her hands outstretched, not touching the intricate, multi-layered barrier of woven steel and enchanted alloys, but feeling its every tremor, its stubborn resistance. It felt alive, a testament to centuries of imperial paranoia, but she was a full smith. This was her birthright. A bead of sweat traced a path down her temple, yet her eyes remained fixed, unblinking on the shimmering barrier. She pushed, not with brute force, but with a whisper of will, urging the individual strands of iron, copper, and silver to loosen their grip. The barrier shrieked, a sound that grated on the teeth as microscopic fractures webbed across its surface. With a final, agonizing surge of power, the entire construct imploded inward, not shattering, but dissolving into a cloud of fine, glittering dust that quickly dispersed, leaving behind an open, gaping maw. For a breath, silence reigned. Marcus stepped through the lingering motes, his expression grim but approving. Elarra felt a brief, fierce surge of triumph, quickly quelled by a cold dread seeping from the darkness beyond. No time for self-congratulation. The true test lay ahead. A shiver, sharp and unwelcome, traced its way down her spine. They descended into the alchemical chamber, a vast, echoing space that seemed to swallow sound and light. The air here was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet like decay. Towering structures of grotesque, organic-looking metal dominated the cavern, pulsing with a dim, unnatural light. Chains of an unfamiliar alloy hung from the ceiling, connecting to arcane devices that whirred with a low, insidious hum. One of them, Elarra noticed, had a small, almost childish carving of a bird on its side, utterly out of place amidst the grim machinery. Her stomach churned, a deep revulsion tightening in her gut. Marcus, his face etched with grim familiarity, gestured towards the central altar, a nightmare of twisted steel. In the suffocating quiet, Valerius watched. Hidden in the deeper shadows of the chamber, his breath caught in his throat. He'd followed the faint trails of unusual energy signatures, the Emperor's vague instructions to investigate anomalies, but nothing had prepared him for this. All his meticulous investigations, the whispers of dissent he dismissed as rabble, the inconsistencies in imperial records, they didn't just coalesce. They crashed down on him, a horrifying, undeniable truth. Then he saw it, a figure suspended within a shimmering cage of pure, raw power, undeniably a metal weaver, their life force visibly draining into the Emperor's central altar. And then, worse, the Emperor himself. Stripped of his usual regal glamour, a skeletal, decaying form sustained by the very lifeblood of the land and its gifted. Valerius's stomach clenched, a cold sweat breaking on his brow. The image seared itself into his mind. His loyalty, once absolute, fractured. The empire, the order he had so fiercely upheld, it was all a lie built on this. His oath, his honor, his entire life's purpose crumbled. He remembered the faces of the enslaved, the silent suffering, the Emperor's chilling indifference. He even thought, for a fleeting second, of the bland imperial rations he'd eaten for years. Could he truly stand by this? The question echoed, cold and clear. Back in the open, Marcus nudged Elarra forward, his voice low and urgent. Elarra, still reeling from the chamber's oppressive atmosphere, nodded, her jaw set. No turning back now, not after this. This was for her mother, for the artisan, for every soul silenced by the Emperor's tyranny. The air grew heavy, thick with a sudden, unnatural cold. A ripple of oppressive power washed over the chamber, a cold, suffocating presence that needed no introduction. Valerius knew, with chilling certainty, that the Emperor was here. His moment was now. With a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, he threw off his cloak, revealing his imperial god armor, and lunged towards a crucial support pillar, a dark, alchemically charged conduit. For the Empire's true future, he roared, a defiant cry that tore through the heavy quiet. From the shadows of the central altar, the Steel Emperor emerged, his form solidifying from the coiling gloom. His eyes, like chips of ice, narrowed on Valerius, a flicker of genuine surprise momentarily marring his otherwise impassive face. "Fool," he hissed, and a tendril of living metal lashed out, striking Valerius with brutal force. Even as he fell, Valerius, with a final, desperate burst of strength, triggered a series of explosive charges he'd subtly placed on the pillar during his reconnaissance. The conduit buckled, spewing sparks and raw energy, momentarily engulfing a section of the chamber in chaos. "Go, Elarra," Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse over the din, pushing her towards the Emperor's altar. "He bought us time." Elarra stumbled forward, her heart pounding, the image of Valerius's unexpected sacrifice etched into her memory. His choice, his ultimate defiance, forged her own resolve. The air crackled. The Steel Emperor turned from the smoldering ruins of the conduit, his gaze, now devoid of surprise, fixing solely on Elarra and Marcus. His features hardened into a frigid mask of fury, his presence radiating absolute control, his eyes promising a slow, agonizing demise. "So, the little thief brings me a gift," the Empress sneered, his voice like grinding steel. Elarra met his gaze, no longer a cowering orphan, but a full smith ready to reclaim her legacy. The air around them grew heavy, charged with a sudden electric tension. A faint, metallic tang bit at Elarra's tongue, a precursor to the storm. The Emperor's sneer deepened, his eyes now blazing with a frigid, ancient power, and a low, resonant groan vibrated through the very stones of the chamber. The battle had truly begun, not with a clash of steel, but with the world itself beginning to tear. Chapter 11: The Weight of Metals. The alchemical chamber crackled. Ozone and ancient rust hung thick in the air, a metallic tang biting Elarra's tongue. The Emperor's sneer was the last thing she truly registered. Then, the world became a shriek of tearing metal. He moved first, a shadowy blur, his will ripping at the very structure around them. Elarra felt the floor beneath her feet ripple, a tremor vibrating in her teeth. Thick plates of iron twisted upwards like grasping claws, threatening to bind her. A cold, guttural laugh ripped from the Emperor's throat. The chamber itself became his weapon. Massive gears embedded in the walls moaned, their teeth elongating into jagged spikes that lunged. Overhead, a vast, intricate network of pipes began to drip, then stream molten copper, threatening a scalding shower. The very pillars supporting the cavernous space buckled, their iron bones protesting under unseen pressure, poised to collapse at his whim. Elarra dodged, her instincts sharp from years in the slums, but this was a different kind of fight. A brawl with a titan of metal, and she was still finding her footing. She pushed back, a desperate surge of power from her core. A section of the floor flattened, creating a small, temporary island of safety. Frustration fled within her, hot and sharp. She was powerful, yes, but he was ancient. His connection to metal was a deep, gnarled root system compared to her own nascent grasp. He laughed again, a sound devoid of mirth, echoing off the newly contorted walls. As he spoke, Elarra felt a strange, chilling drain, not just from her, but from the very air from the metals around them. She felt the essence being drawn out of the copper in the pipes, the iron in the pillars, even the faint traces of metal in her own blood. He wasn't merely manipulating, he was consuming. Behind her, the clash of steel intensified. Marcus, a blur of defiance, battled the Emperor's elite god. His movements were precise, deadly, each parry and strike buying Elarra precious seconds. His gaze flicked to her occasionally, a silent plea for her to hold on. Elarra, meanwhile, struggled against the Emperor's relentless assault. Metallic bindings coiled, attempting to ensnare her limbs, her throat. She ripped free, gritting her teeth, her muscles screaming with the immense effort. "Fight, Elarra," Marcus rawed. His voice was strained, almost lost in the din, but she caught it. His words stoked something within her, a fierce defiance against the crushing weight of the Emperor's might. She remembered her mother, a fleeting image of a strong, determined face, a whisper of a lullaby she barely recalled. This power, this heritage, wasn't just hers. It was her mother's, her ancestors', a torch passed down through generations of oppression. The chamber shuddered under the Emperor's sustained will, the very air vibrating with the strain. He pressed his advantage, sending a wave of sharpened metal shards hurtling towards her. Each one whistled with malevolent intent. "You cannot defy what is eternal, child," the Emperor purred, his voice oozing with dark confidence. But Elarra's rage boiled. It was stoked by the memory of the enslaved artisan, by the faces of those she'd seen in the slums, by generations crushed under the Emperor's heel. It wasn't just her life at stake, it was everyone's. A guttural cry tore from her throat, raw and primal. She stopped merely defending. She began to push. The metal shards halted mid-air, shuddered, then twisted back towards the emperor with a force that made him flinch. He was momentarily surprised, a flicker of something almost akin to fear in his ancient eyes. That flicker was all Elarra needed. The copper bird, a small, unassuming token, flashed in her mind, a memory of home, of fragile hope, of lives lived and lost. Her grief, her anger, her sheer, unyielding will coalesced. A surge of raw, full smith power erupted. The air around her shimmered, not with the emperor's dark, draining energy, but with a fierce, almost blinding light that pulsed from her core. The metals in the chamber, once subservient to the emperor, now sang to her, echoing her will. The massive, oppressive steel plates that formed the emperor's alchemical heart, embedded deep in the chamber's far wall, began to hum, a discordant vibration against his control. The emperor's eyes widened, a genuine shock contorting his face. "Impossible," he hissed, his voice losing its customary composure. But it wasn't. Elarra reached out, not just with her hands, but with her very essence. She connected to the heart of the emperor's power, to the core of his dark alchemy. She didn't merely manipulate, she fed it. She poured her boundless, nascent full smith energy into it, overwhelming its ancient mechanisms. The steel plates of the alchemical heart glowed white-hot, then blue, then a searing, impossible purple as the immense energy overloaded its ancient mechanisms. A deafening roar ripped through the chamber as the emperor's life-sustaining ritual machinery detonated, a violent burst of uncontrolled energy. The ground shuddered violently, throwing Marcus and the remaining guards off their feet. The emperor screamed, a raw sound of agony and disbelief, as his connection to the metal, to his immortality, was brutally severed. Massive cracks spiderwebbed across the chamber walls, dust and debris rained down in thick clouds. The V they burst into a less damaged, but still convulsing, section of the palace's underbelly, gasping for breath. Marcus pulled her to her feet, his hand gripping her arm, his face streaked with grime but alight with a fierce, desperate triumph. "You did it, Elarra. Now run." A searing pain lanced through Elarra's side, a fresh memory of the emperor's desperate, final strike. The tremors continued, a deep, resonant hum of destruction rippling through the city above. She glanced back at the gaping maw of the collapsing chamber, awe and terror warring within her. The emperor was no longer eternal. His power, the source of his 2-century reign, was shattered. The world was tearing itself apart, plunging them into a terrifying, uncertain dawn. They had to keep moving. Chapter 12, A Sky of Copper and Ash. The world shrieked around them, screaming metal, crumbling masonry. Elarra gasped, air thick with dust and the acrid tang of ozone, as Marcus shoved her forward. The chamber, nexus of the emperor's dark power, imploded behind them, an imploding chaos of twisted architecture and screeching conduits. A searing pain lanced through Elarra's side, a memory of the emperor's desperate, final strike. Adrenaline coursed, overriding all else. Her hands, scraped raw, instinctively clutched the rough stone wall as they stumbled. They stumbled through a warren of forgotten service tunnels. The very ground beneath their feet still convulsed with the aftershocks of the emperor's shattered alchemical core. Elarra's mouth was dry, tasting like ash. Marcus, despite his own exhaustion, moved with an unyielding focus. He tugged her arm, his gaze scanning the crumbling tunnel ahead. "Faster, Elarra, we're not safe yet." They emerged into a narrow alleyway, hidden by centuries of accumulated refuse, into a city in upheaval. Buildings swayed, dust plumes billowed, and the distant screams of a frightened populace echoed through the urban canyons. Elarra noticed a child's broken doll, one eye missing, lying face down in the rubble. It was chaos, yes, but a chaos that felt different, like a fever breaking. As they staggered out of the alley's oppressive shadows, a collective gasp rippled through the nearest crowd. Elarra looked up, following their gazes, and her breath hitched. Above them, the perpetual bronze haze that had choked the sky for 2 centuries was thinning. Great plumes of volcanic smoke, once an oppressive blanket, were dissipating, swirling away like spectral armies. For the first time, a pale, soft light, the color of a winter dawn, bled through. It wasn't the full sun, not yet, but it was light. A great cry erupted from the streets below, a sound of disbelief, then dawning understanding, then a wave of raw, surging joy. News of the emperor's fall, or at least the shattering of his immortal power, swept like a torrent through the reeling capital. From every alley and every hovel, people spilled out, their faces a mixture of fear and fervent elation. The very air felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Marcus watched, a glimmer of something unreadable in his eyes, as the first true rays of light touched the soiled rooftops. He had dreamed of this day, lived for it, but the reality was far more profound than any vision of vengeance. He glanced at Elarra, who stood transfixed, her face streaked with ash, her eyes wide with a wonder he hadn't seen there before. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his hand. Weeks later, the city was still a maelstrom of rebuilding and a delicate, burgeoning hope. The skies, though still marred by distant eruptions, offered more and more glimpses of true blue, a color many had only ever seen in faded tapestries. Elarra, no longer just a thief of shadows, found herself thrust into a role she had never imagined. Sometimes she still thought about that perfect, untouched apple she'd seen in a merchant's stall once before all this. People looked to her now, their eyes filled with a desperate, almost crushing hope. She spent her days navigating the tumultuous politics of newly freed factions, mediating disputes, and trying to establish some semblance of order from the stunning, bewildering chaos. "It's like trying to herd a flock of iron filings," she'd grumble to Lyra, her most trusted advisor. Lyra, ever patient, would offer a faint smile, but Elarra knew the truth of it. "Except these filings have opinions," Elarra continued, running a hand through her hair, "and they all want to go in different directions." The weight of responsibility, the immense scale of the expectations, pressed down on her, heavier than any metal she had ever bent. One evening, Marcus found her on a rooftop overlooking the city, the setting sun painting the clearing sky in hues of burnished copper and rose. She was tracing the intricate lines of the copper bird, the artisan's lost gift, with a pensive finger. "They need you, Elarra," he said, his voice a low current, softer than she'd ever heard it. He cleared his throat, a rough sound in the quiet. His gaze, usually so sharp, softened as he looked at her. "They see you as a symbol." She turned, her gaze meeting his. "A symbol of what?" she scoffed, the sound a little too sharp. "A girl who got lucky, a weapon. I don't know how to lead them, Marcus. I know how to survive, how to take, how to fight." "You know how to fight for something bigger than yourself," Marcus said, his voice steady. He stepped closer, his shadow falling long beside hers. "You know how to inspire." "That's more than enough." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the nascent city below. "My vengeance is done, Elarra. My purpose was to shatter the chains. Yours, I think, is to build the future." He turned back to her, his expression unyielding but not unkind. "The choice is yours, of course. You can walk away, find a quiet corner of this new world, and no one would blame you. Or you can stand in the light and guide them." Elarra looked from Marcus to the copper bird in her hand. Its intricate lines, the artisan's lost gift, seemed to pulse with the emergent light of the truly free sky. She shifted her gaze to the vast city below, a canvas of broken stone and rising hope. The bird, small and fragile, yet perfectly formed, felt heavy in her palm, a surprising weight. It wasn't just metal, it was a life saved, a life fought for, a promise of something beautiful built from something common. Her mother had been a full smith, yes, but she had also been a revolutionary, a leader, a weaver of unseen bonds. Elarra closed her fingers around the cool metal, feeling the ghost of her mother's strength, remembering the connections she had forged, not just the metal. The weight of it settled deep within her. A moment later, a gap in the clouds widened dramatically, and a direct shaft of golden sunlight pierced through, bathing the entire capital in its warmth. It was a beautiful sight, a collective sigh from the city below. Elarra barely noticed. The decision, slowly forged within her, had solidified. She knew what she had to do. Elarra took a deep breath, the scent of fresh air, not ash, filling her lungs. She looked at Marcus, a spark of something new in her eyes, not rage, but a steadfast resolve. "I'll lead," she said, her voice clear and strong. But not alone, not like him. She held up the copper bird, letting the sunlight catch its gleaming surface. "We build this together. On trust, not fear." Marcus smiled, an unfeigned smile that softened the etched lines of his face. He nodded, a tacit acknowledgement of her choice, a weight perceptibly easing from his shoulders. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in ever-deepening hues of bronze and twilight ash, Elarra stood tall, the weight of metals no longer a crushing force, but a tool in her hands. The city hummed below, still scarred in places, still uncertain, but now finally ready to begin.